So we are going to be talking or starting to talk eventually about Job chapter 9 and 10. This is Job's response to Bildad. Bildad was very direct, very aggressive. He didn't have any of the tact or compassion that Eliphaz uh, demonstrated. But Bildad also, in the end of the speech, you can tell that he hopes for Job. He believes Job is one of the righteous people who will repent, and that the Lord will restore him. And like Eliphaz, like Eliphaz, Bildad believes that Job's problem is that he's sinned, and he's sinned very badly. And so compared to Eliphaz, I have kind of a summary of Eliphaz's speech and Bildad. So Eliphaz, as you remember, he suggests that trouble is a universal consequence of just being a human, of having human imperfection. And he advises Job to accept God's correction without any complaint and to learn from his mistakes. He assumes that Job's made some mistakes, sins. He never actually says that, but that Job has sinned and that this is why he's being disciplined. And he just needs to repent. And so um, he acknowledges Job's past integrity, but he does urge Job to seek God's presence, to repent, and to trust that God will justify and justly restore him after Job has been sufficiently punished. So that's Eliphaz, and that represents the wisdom of the world in the kind of the softest tones. Bildad is much more harsh. He says, the summary of Bildad would sound something like this: Job, you sinned, and so you suffer. Repent and change your behavior, and God will restore you. Your end will be better than your beginning. If you do not repent, you will perish. Just as God destroyed your children for their transgressions, he will certainly destroy you if you do not repent. This is wisdom. So that's Bildad. Now, even though they sound, one's soft and one's harsh, it's the same message, basically the same message. You're in this predicament because it's something you did. I'm your friend, and so I'm going to tell you what you need to do, even though you should already know this. You need to tell God you're sorry, and then he'll restore you. And that's the wisdom of the ages. That's the way the universe works. Everybody knows this. Eliphaz appeals to spiritual guidance, personal experience, and the wisdom of the ages. Bildad basically appeals to the wisdom of the ages. All the wise men know this from all time, Job. And it's just the pagan worldview. It's just the you get in what you get out type of thing. Um, so in I guess I wanted to say one more thing about Bildad. At the end of chapter 8, at least the second half of chapter 8, is all this parable about these two plants, right? And it's hard to figure out what's going on. And I reading it was hard for me to figure out what's going on. Several times I looked at it. I think I do understand it now. But it occurred to me that when Job says to about his friends and to them, you're not listening to me, you're not paying attention to me, you don't understand my situation, that Bildad gives a beautiful example of totally not understanding what's going on. Because why would you speak so, in a parable to somebody who's suffering as much as Job? You expect him to to follow that and figure it out? Why don't you just say, good people have good things happen to them, Job, and bad people have bad things happen to them? Because that's all that the parable said. But he spends 10 verses giving this, parabolic story about two plants, and very hard to follow. And I'm wondering if a guy, if I had a headache, I wouldn't be able to follow it. Now, Job had much more than a headache, right? So, I just think it just shows not only insensitivity, but he doesn't comprehend what the situation is and what Job is dealing with. And I think that's part of a kind of a defense mechanism, as Mike suggested several weeks ago. The three friends have a vested interest in making sure that Job, he must have done something, because otherwise if Job didn't do anything and look what happened to him, wow, it could happen to me. So the friends have kind of a vested interest to not really read the situation right and to just give Job the wisdom of the ages, so-called. So what's happening in these two chapters, which we'll read in a couple of minutes? I think we want to skip down to the very last page in the outline, at least as it is on line. I'm not sure if this is in the one I just sent out, but on the last page, I give a summary of these uh, two chapters, and I'll just go ahead and read that. So in chapter 9, basically verses 3 to 35, Job considers and then rejects 6 possible ways to escape from his problem. His problem is the loss of both his visible right standing before God, which was his good life, and his existential right standing before God, his personal right standing before God in himself, his peace. And the possible solutions to the problem are arranged into 3 groups, and this is the way they are in the text. And they represent Job's progression of thought, starting with looking to himself as a solution and moving to others, and finally, God. So solutions that rely upon Job alone, there are 4 of them. I could win a debate with God in court. That's the first thing he considers. The second thing he considers is, I could beat God in a test of strength. The third one is, I could ignore the problem and put on a happy face. And the fourth one is, I could perform some really serious ceremonial washing. I could scrub myself till I bleed and prove how righteous I am, that kind of thing. So all of those rely on him. That's all based on his actions, his words. Then there's a solution that relies on somebody else, but not on God. He says, a mediator, perhaps a mediator could bring us together. And that sounds really good. And we love that solution because we know that that's what God does. But Job ultimately says that that won't work. And he comes up with the 6th solution, the solution that relies on God. He says, God could stop afflicting me and make me comfortable so that I could speak to him and win my argument. And note that this doesn't rely on God. This argument relies on Job, right? So in the first chapter, chapter 9, we're going to go through these kind of 6 ways that Job considers, and he rejects each one, and we'll look at the reasons why. But he brings them up, thinks them through, says, nah, that won't work, and goes to the next one. And he's trying to think of a way to restore his relationship with God. And that becomes more and more apparent as you go through the dialogues of Job. In the next dialogue, after Zophar speaks, Job, it's very clear that Job is trying to restore his relationship. He's not actually saying, like the court case, he's not actually saying, God, you're in the wrong and I'm in the right. He's not trying to do that. In chapter 10, Job speaks his mind and describes what he would say to God in his present tortured state. It's what he would say to God. He's not saying what he is saying to God. He's saying, I would say this if I had a chance. And his words should be taken as an expression of a man in great pain and confusion. It should not be assumed that Job would say these same things if God had withdrawn the affliction and made Job at ease before him. So, which is why in his previous chapter, chapter 9, the last solution was, God could stop afflicting me, make me comfortable so I could actually say what I want to say. We need to take that into account. So that's what's going on kind of in the big outline of these 2 chapters. So I think we'll start reading it. We'll just read through it and see what we talk about. So here we go. So I'm going to read from the ESV. Does somebody else, let me ask, does anybody else want to read? I don't mind reading the whole thing, but if somebody wants to read or doesn't want to hear me read, it's a good time to volunteer. All right. I will start. Chapter 9. So replying to, he's actually going to be replying to everybody, but he's replying right after Bildad spoke. It's what I found when I was trying to write the transitions between the chapters. It's very difficult because when the people are talking to Job, it's pretty easy, right? Bildad says this to Job. But when Job responds, sometimes he's just thinking out loud and not talking directly to them. Sometimes he's talking to all of them. Sometimes he's just kind of going back and forth between thinking out loud and talking to them. So, so my transition here is that Job is saying these things after Bildad said some other things. So, so then Job answered and said, "Truly, I know that it is so." So he's probably affirming there everything that Bildad said. Um, if you've sinned, Bildad never says if you've sinned, but the person who sins, when he repents, God will restore him. That type of thing. Truly, I know that it is so, but how can a man be in the right before God? This is that really key word that we looked at before. It's about being righteous or have right standing before God. Job is saying, he's not saying, how can I win an argument? He's saying, um, how can I be in the presence of God? He's holy and I'm not. That's the basic thing. If one wished to contend with him, one could not answer him once in 1,000 times. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and succeeded? He who removes mountains, and they know it not, when he overturns them in his anger, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble, who commands the sun and it does not rise, who seals up the stars, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea, who made the bear and Orion, the Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, who does great things beyond searching out, and marvelous things beyond number. Behold, he passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. Behold, he snatches away. Who can turn him back? Who will say to him, what are you doing? God will not turn back his anger. Beneath him bowed the helpers of Rahab. How then can I answer him, choosing my words with him? Though I am in the right, I cannot answer him. I must appeal for mercy to my accuser. If I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my words without cause. He will not let me get my breath, but fills me with bitterness. If it is a contest of strength, behold, he is mighty. If it is a matter of justice, who can summon him? Though I am in the right, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I am blameless, he would prove me perverse. I am blameless. I regard not myself. I loathe my life. It is all one. Therefore I say, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not he, who then is it? My days are swifter than a runner. They flee away. They see no good. They go by like skiffs of reed, like an eagle swooping on the prey. If I say, I will forget my complaint, I will put off my sad face and be of good cheer, I become afraid of all my suffering, for I know you will not hold me innocent. I shall be condemned. Why then do I labor in vain? If I wash myself with snow and cleanse my hands with lye, yet you will plunge me into a pit, and my own clothes will abhor me. For he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we should come to trial together. There is no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both. Let him take away his rod from me, and let not dread of him terrify me. Then I would speak without fear of him, for I am not so in myself. So those were we'll go through it in more detail, but those were the 6 options with considered and rejected. Spent most of the time on the court case, but the other ones were there too, and we'll go through it a little more slowly. Let me read the rest of his reply. I loathe my life. So it's the 3rd time now that Job has said this, the 2nd time in this speech. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands? and favor the designs of the wicked. Have you eyes of flesh? Do you see as man sees? Are your days as the days of man, or your years as a man's years? That you seek out my iniquity and search for my sin, although you know that I am not guilty, and there is none to deliver out of your hand? Your hands fashioned me and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether. Remember that you have made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust? Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? You clothed me with skin and flesh and knit me together with the bones and sinews. You have granted me life and steadfast love, and your care has preserved my spirit. Yet these things you hid in your heart. I know that this was your purpose. If I sin, you watch me and do not acquit me of my iniquity. If I am guilty, woe to me. If I am in the right, I cannot lift up my head, for I am filled with disgrace and look on my affliction. And were my head lifted up, you would hunt me like a lion, and again work wonders against me. You renew your witness against me and increase your vexation toward me. You bring fresh troops against me. Why did you bring me out from the womb? Would that I had died before any eye had seen me, and were as though I had not been carried from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? Then cease and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer before I go, and I shall not return to the land of darkness and deep shadow, the land of gloom, like thick darkness, like deep shadow without any order, where light is as thick as darkness. So, uh, does anybody have an overall impression of this?
As I was reading it earlier, I was reading NIV and it seemed like we were talking about how Job seems to be going right up to the edge of saying something really bad about God.
Yeah,
So the ESV seems a little softer because I was reading through the NIV and thinking this this might be, at least up to this point, the some of the worst things that Job has said.
yeah, there's some pretty shocking statements. Not shocking in his predicament, I guess, but
Right.
theologically completely incorrect. Um, yeah, I noticed that the NIV does uh, what you noticed. It's a little bit favorable to Job, a little more favorable. It's like you could translate it either way. You know, he said a really bad thing or he said a moderately bad thing. NIV goes with moderately bad. Nothing wrong with that. Um, so, there are some glimpses of light. One of the commentators said that Job's speeches, all of them, are kind of like the history of the world. It's mostly sin, death, and destruction, and heartache and pain. But every once in a while, there are glimmers of light, happiness, and joy. And so Job's speeches are like that, where he's wandering around in the dark, running into things, and every once in a while, he says something that's just a glimmer of light. The section about the mediator, where he says there isn't one. I think the NIV handles that very differently. Um, Maybe we'll look at that when we get there. But um, you know, he comes across with some. Basically, I guess I'll say it like this: there are little threads of the gospel that run through the book of Job, and Job comes across them every once in a while. And in these earlier chapters, he kind of considers it and then uh, goes on to something else. His darkness, his confusion is so it hasn't broken through yet. Still in his uh, pain and darkness. So let's look at what's going on. We'll start back in chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. So Job answered, I'll read the NIV this time. Job replied, Indeed, I know that this is true. Um, he's affirming what Bildad said, a righteous man, or a man who God has a good relationship with. When he sins and he's disciplined for it, when he repents, God will restore him. I think that's what he's agreeing with. That's basically the last thing that Bildad said. But he disagrees with Bildad, right? Indeed, I know that this is true, verse 2, but, right, disagreeing. How can mere mortals prove their innocence before God? So this is interesting. The NIV has, how can a mere mortal prove his innocence before God? So, but the ESV just has the really simple, how can a man be in the right before God? Which doesn't have to mean, and it probably doesn't, the first meaning probably is not prove my right, prove myself right or my innocence, but I have a bad relationship right now. How can I have a good relationship? That's the ESV kind of leans toward that, where the NIV is leaning toward what follows. The first suggestion is a court case. How can I prove that I'm innocent? Um, I think what's going to happen, I think what's going on in Job's head is that he imagines, and why he wants to have this court case, which he's going to bring up, he imagines that if he were to be declared right or righteous before God by God, then God would stop treating him like a condemned sinner and would restore him to the peaceful relationship that he once enjoyed. And so the question then, I think, is a question about the question about being right before God is a question about Job's relationship with God. And it's that relationship that Job is always the most concerned with. In the outline, I have a quote from a commentator, John Hartley. He says, Job gives vent to the deep agitation of his inner thoughts. In this speech, chapters 9 and 10, he tends to state a position boldly, then abandon it when he sees its difficulty and jump to another idea, which is also quickly abandoned. Other times he reverts to despair, almost the utter despair of his opening curse lament of chapter 3. His jumping about reflects his frustration at the lack of any insight into the reasons for his plight. Hartley doesn't make this point, but one of the things that I think of when I read this quotation, when I read it in the commentator, was, oh, well, this is why it's so hard to read through Job and understand at the first or second or third or fifth or 10th read what's going on. Because Job is not, you cannot assume,
Hmm.
I guess we'll say that, you can't assume that Job is staying on the subject, right? He changes who he's talking to. He changes if he's even talking to anybody. And he's just going through his thoughts. He's like a man who's locked in in this, well, not locked, but he's in this room that has 25 doors to lead out, and he doesn't know which one to take. And he just goes and opens the door and looks down the hall and then shuts the door and comes back, opens another door. That's what Job's doing. He's just frantically trying to think through, how do I get out of this? Why did this happen? Um, so it makes it hard for the reader, right? Probably was also hard for Job's friends. And it could be that they were trying to listen to him, but couldn't figure out what he was talking about half the time. So, um, so he brings up the first option in verse 3 through 18. He wants to maybe win a battle in court against God, maybe call God to the stand and ask him, why are you treating me like this? That's what he does in his next response. He says, this is what I would say to God. Why are you treating me like this? Um, what did I do? You know, Job, and he doesn't say it with the attitude of, I didn't do anything. He says, tell me what I did so I can understand why you did this. Um, so verse 3, if anyone wished to contend with him, one could not answer him once in 1,000 times, right? You could not find words to answer God. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength, or NIV, his wisdom is profound, his power is vast. Who has resisted him and come out unscathed? So why won't this work? Well, it won't work because you won't be able to figure out what to say because God's God and you're not. He's too wise, he's too powerful, and nobody who has ever opposed him has succeeded. And so those are the first three reasons why you won't be able to, why this idea won't work. Verse 5, he gives another reason. He says he moves mountains without their knowing it and overturns them in his anger. He acts without our knowledge or consent. He is not accountable. I can't bring God to court. He's not accountable to me, you know? So, so who is he, right? Verse 6 or verse 5b, he overturns the mountains in his anger. He's the judge of the earth. This is who he is. He's not accountable. He's the ruler of all things. Verse 6, he shakes the earth from its place and makes its pillars tremble. All of creation obeys him. Verse 7, he speaks to the sun and it does not shine. He seals off the light of the stars. These are all reasons why this idea won't work. God himself is the creator. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He is the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the south. Because he is the creator, the creature has no authority to say to him, you must do as I say. And so Job is thinking this through. He's going, I can call him to court. Yeah, that'll work. No, that's not going to work. Right. Verse 10, Job says his works are great and marvelous and beyond our comprehension. This is related to he does things without asking, right? He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. So whatever he does, there's always the possibility that I won't understand it. Even if he answers me, it's incomprehensible. And then he repeats the idea that nobody can stop God in whatever he does. God's not accountable. He's powerful. Verse 11, when he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. If he snatches away, who can stop him? Right? Who can stop him? Conclusion then is no one can question the rightness or wisdom of what God does. That is 12, verse 12b. Who can say to him, what are you doing? So Job starts off in verse 3 with, I can call God to court. I could ask him, what are you doing? And he concludes, no, nobody can say that. I can't say that. This won't work. So he considers this idea of court, rejects it. Now, in these verses 5 through 13 about the court, or 3 to 13 about the court, there's kind of a hymn there of praise, or it looks like it, to God's power, right? He's created these, he destroys these, he brings these up, he takes these down. He is all powerful, he's creator, he is wise beyond our comprehension. These are all kind of praise type of things. It's almost like a psalm. And commentators differ on how they handle this. Christopher Ashe, who I think has a really good commentary on Job, implies, or at least to me seems to imply, that Job's focusing here on negative things. And what that means is that Job is giving a parody of a hymn to praise. I'm not, I don't think so. If that means that Job is saying you don't deserve praise, I'm just mocking you. I don't think that's the case at all. I think he's actually he's starting to list examples that when you get to the response to Zophar, he's going to turn into counterexamples for things that the friends have said. Oh, only, God only, it's only fools and, wicked people that God afflicts. And Job's going to say, well, God throws the wise men down into confusion and God destroys kings. And, it's more of the kind of the negative thing, but he's saying, no, you're wrong. So I think he's already kind of thinking about that as he goes through this. Um, and then John Hartley, who I already mentioned before, read the quote from him. He he doesn't make a comment on whether this is a parody or not. Um, where I think Carol, you just joined us, right? Hello, glad you joined us. So we're in chapter 9, talking about verses 5 to 13 right now, or 5 to 12, or maybe 13. So John Hartley kind of sees what's going on in verses 5 through 13, this kind of hymn thing. He says it's all related to what's going on in verse 4. Let's read verse 4 again. Talking about God, he is wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has hardened himself against him and succeeded. So what he sees here are deeds of wisdom or acts of wisdom, which is the first thing. He's wise in heart. Acts of power, wise in strength, mighty in strength. And the third thing is that God has victory over his foes, right? Who has hardened himself against him and succeeded. So those three things, deeds of power, deeds, acts of wisdom, and God's victory over foes, Hartley sees these verses, this hymn from 5 to 13, is kind of set out in those three whatever headings. So deeds of power, 5 through 7, 5 through 7. He moves mountains without their knowing it, overturns them in his anger, shakes the earth from its place, makes its pillars tremble. He speaks to the sun and it does not shine. He seals off the light of the stars. Hartley sees deeds of power. Acts of wisdom in 8 through 10. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He is the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. That's, this is how Hartley's laying it out. I'm not sure about this section here. I don't know how this is related to wisdom, not on the surface at least. But then God's victory over foes, 11 through 13. When he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. If he snatches away, who can stop him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? God does not restrain his anger. Even the cohorts of Rahab cowered at his feet. So God's victory over foes. So for what it's worth, there may be some structural thing there that somebody might find useful or interesting. So I thought I would include it. But moving on in the reasons, Job is still in the next couple of verses, he's still considering meeting God in court as a possible solution, although he's already given several reasons why that won't work. But in 13 through 15, he says, God does not restrain his anger. Even the cohorts of Rahab cowered at his feet. How then can I dispute with him? How can I find words to argue with him? Though I were innocent, I would not answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy. What Job is saying is that he believes that God is determined that he will not turn back his anger against Job. He's set, angry, and it doesn't matter what Job says. In fact, Job can't even think of what he could possibly say. This is a reiteration of verse 3. So Job's conclusion then is, I must drop my case and plead for mercy. Ultimately, though, Job is going to reject that because he is going to say later that God has determined to be continually angry with me. So, so verse 16, he gives even another reason why the court thing won't work. He says, even if God showed up in court, I would not believe that he's taking me seriously or even listening to my side of the story. Verse 16, even if I summoned him and he responded, I do not believe he will give me a hearing. And why is that? Well, 17 through 18, NIV, he would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason. He would not let me catch my breath. So Job says basically, he's going to crush me with a storm. He's going to attack Job with unceasing attacks. Job's thinking, why would I believe that he cares? I mean, he's just attacking me. He's just going to keep attacking me. And in sorry, 18b, he says, God would overwhelm him with misery. Or verse 18 in the ESV says, he fills me with bitterness. So Job is saying, I would not be able to tell my side because he would not let me get a breath. He's just unceasingly attacking me rather than being able to give a rational defense from a position of a place where I could think it through. I'm just full of bitterness and misery. So he's listing all these reasons why a court case isn't going to work. And I think he's pretty much beat this horse till it's dead, right? He's said, this isn't a good idea. This won't work. Never can work. So he has said about God that God, in verse 17, God multiplies my wounds without cause. And I just want to spend a minute and talk about the without cause, because we've seen that come up before, right? Another quote from Hartley here, John Hartley. Frustrated, Job complains that God is punishing him brutally. Specifically, Job says, God is guilty of multiplying my wounds without cause. The phrase without cause means that God is acting capriciously, having no grounds to punish his servant. The author skillfully uses this Hebrew word, which is a pivotal word in the scenes before Yahweh found in the prologue. There, the Satan skeptically asked whether Job served God for nothing or without cause in chapter 1, verse 9. After Job survived his first test, God retorted to the Satan that the Satan had incited him to afflict Job without cause, chapter 2, verse 3. But now Job perceives that God has afflicted him without cause, same word. Whereas the Satan doubted Job's motive for being righteous, the trial leads Job to doubt the justice of God's actions in permitting him to suffer. This dimension of the trial strikes a raw nerve in Job. God allows him to be tested in a way that leads Job to question the very basis of his faith, namely that God is just and good. No stronger test exists for a faithful servant of God. On the other hand, God has such confidence in his servant that he is not afraid to have his own goodness appear tainted to Job. So I wanted to read this quote because I think that it is insightful that this test is a test of the very basis of Job's faith, and that God doesn't mind looking bad to bring about his goodwill and to teach us something. God doesn't mind looking like a condemned criminal hanging on a cross for the sake of his glory and the salvation of his people. God doesn't mind looking foolish. And God will test his people as to the basis of their faith. Right? That's the whole point of being tested and having trials and growing to relinquishing your grip on the things that are not from God. Right? It's so God, he doesn't always test us in that manner, but he did test Job that way, and he has tested other people like that. So Job uses the same phrase, without cause, about God. You're attacking me without cause.
Chuck,
Catherine, yes.
if I may interrupt for a moment while I can still think clearly,
Sure.
would this be also what you called in chapter 1, verse 8, where what you just read from verse 17, and multiply my wounds without cause? Would this be another parallel of Jesus
Yes.
in 17? Oh, good. I saw that and I thought, oh, wow, that looks like another one, because you said that there are several of them in Job. So I don't want to miss any of them.
Yeah, this
Thank
is
you.
yeah, it's the cry of dereliction, right? Why, my God, why have you
Mm.
forsaken me? In other
Yes,
words,
yes, yes.
I'm dying here under the wrath of God for no reason, right? Why?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah,
Oh,
this
thank
is what
you.
this is
Yeah.
what Job is feeling that. Becky.
Mhm.
So I'm reading this and applying it to what I know, and I guess I'm cutting Job a lot more slack than everybody else is, because I am somebody who, when I'm faced with a big problem, I talk out loud.
Mhm.
So and it's unrestricted because I'm trying to figure out what all the possibilities could be to solve this problem. And so I see Job saying, well, if I did this, that wouldn't work because God's all powerful, and if I try to defend myself, I couldn't do that because I wouldn't be able to get a coherent word out that would make any sense, and it wouldn't work as a plea. And God gets to do anything he wants to, and who am I to stand against him? And if God's angry, um we already know that he doesn't restrain it because of the cohorts of Rahab who ended up cowering at his feet. And so I think of these things, and I would be thinking out loud. I wouldn't be meaning for them to be aimed at anybody,
Right,
even God.
right.
I would just be thinking out loud. And if you happen to be with me, it may be confusing. And my example is, this got me in trouble at work with my manager one time, and we had to come to an understanding because she said, "What do you think about this?" And so I said, "Well, I think if we did this and did that and did this and the other thing, and I need to think about it for a little bit." She took that to mean I was committing to do that.
Uh-huh.
And so
Right.
when we had our next meeting, she says, "So how are you coming along with this?" And I looked at her and went, "What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about." She says, "Well, you said this and this and this and this." And I said, "You asked me what I thought. I told you what I thought. This was in no way a commitment to do anything, because it
Right.
turns out that as I thought about it, these are the things that will get in the way of completing that."
Yeah. Yeah,
And
you're absolutely right.
so I got, I thought I was thinking out loud because that's what I thought I had been asked. She heard it as a commitment.
Yeah. I had a couple of lines on my outline that I skipped over for some reason. I'll just read them right now. Uh, Job thinks through what he might say, or he thinks through his six solutions to his twofold problem and he rejects it. But he thinks through what he might say, and he verbalizes his thoughts as part of the process of evaluating them. It's exactly right what you said, that Job is not, he is not talking to his three friends, and he's not talking to God. He's he's listening to his own thoughts and going, "Oh, okay, that won't work." Yeah, I heard that. You said that. I said that. He's doing the dialogue, right? He's doing the dialogue. We should have a court case, and then he says, "Oh no, that won't work because of these reasons." And then so he's talking to himself, and yeah, and that's part of the problem. I often think, or I have often thought since we started this study, and I've been reading through Job, that this would be a really, you see skits that are based on people mishearing things or miscommunicating, and basically most jokes are about hinge on that type of thing too, double meanings and things like that. Um, this would be a hilarious play if it wasn't, because everything is based on people not listening to the other person, or people latching on to things that weren't meant to be taken the way they were stated. Or this is the whole problem between him and his friends, in addition to the worldview, is that they're responding to things that he didn't even mean. Oh, it's quite interesting. I think, Mike, you were going to say something. You had your leaning forward like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I guess so. I just, as we've been talking through this, it's helped me to come to some sort of idea of what's going on here. So I guess like you were mentioning about Christopher Ashe saying this seems to be sort of a parody of a hymn of praise. Like what's going on here? So what I picked up on is he's recounting these, this sort of hymn, what looks like formally at least like a hymn of praise. Um, I think there's like a certain exasperation that he has. It's more out of like befuddlement or exasperation of he's overwhelmed and he's reciting the power of God. I think what he's getting at is like God's transcendence, and
Hmm.
that is like, and then he's contrasting that with our dependence and our complete separation from God's ways and our ways. So
Hmm.
he's befuddled with God's. He's just expressing here in this poetic form like God's transcendence. So uh, that, I guess, if you look at verse 17, which sounds pretty strong, like the most I think kind way of looking at verse 17, if this is the case that he's just saying God is so transcendent and we are so below him that a statement like in verse 17 that God would crush me and multiply my wounds for no reason. He's saying that there's no way we can understand like the actions of God, no
Right.
reason that we can come to, no reason that we can arrive at and be like, okay, yeah, that's a satisfying reason explanation to help us understand what we're going through and what God is doing and what God is thinking. And um, so I I guess that's how I'm taking all this is that
Hmm.
um, a lot of these things a big part of his struggle is that he's like there's nothing I can do that like from my human perspective that can give me a satisfactory explanation for what's going on. And like even if I were like where he says, even if I were able to like argue my case and I was innocent and I could argue my case, it wouldn't even work because what does my best argument amount to in God's when presented to God's transcendence, it's meaningless basically.
Yeah. Foolish gibberish is what it is.
Yeah.
Right. Um, yeah. And so, I see that we're almost at 8 o'clock. But something you brought up, Mike. So there are a couple of ways, right, to take these statements like verse 17. It could be that he's saying, God, you do things with no reason. Or he's
Right.
saying, like Mike, what you suggested is that he's saying, because he's already said in the same speech, right, that
Mm.
God does things for reasons that are incomprehensible. And he's just repeating that idea here. It's no reason that you could explain it to me, but I wouldn't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. Um, One of the things that that I that I notice, and maybe somebody else has noticed this too, reading Job, is that one of the things that Job appears to toy with, consider briefly, is what if God isn't the way I think he is? What if he's not just, right? So, and that's usually the issue. What if he's not just? And you know what? If God isn't just, you can't win a court case against him either, right? So I'm not saying that's what's going on here, but I think sometimes Job does say things that are kind of he's looking at everything in his worldview and going, which part is it that's out of place here? You know? What and he goes, well, what if God isn't the way that I think he is? What if he doesn't love me? You know? What if he isn't just? What if he isn't powerful? And he's like, no, God is powerful. God is just. God does love me. You notice when he goes through the whole thing, I loathe my life, I wish I would die. And he goes all through the things and he says, why did you even let me live? And then he says, you gave me life. You knit me together. You gave me steadfast love and faithfulness. He's like, these are like pulling back from the brink of, disaster, right? Words. He's like, I thought you were terrible. No, actually, you love me. So he goes back and forth kind of between, um, he's just going around going, what is it that can fix this? Maybe I've misunderstood God. Um, so it could be that he's saying, I wouldn't understand if you explained it to me, but it also could be that he's saying, you don't have a reason for the things you do. But just like every other thing that he says out loud, he rejects it. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
think we get a quick little view too into his disagreement with his friends too, because they're presenting themselves as, we do understand what's going on. We understand the reasons for everything that's happening here. This is all within our ability to understand, and we understand God's ways, and here you go. This is what you have to do. And Job is saying, no, nobody really understands, and we might understand in some cases, like in some situations with God, we might understand things about him and things about our relationship with him, but not like perfectly and not completely and not always, right? It's
mhm.
there are times when we are at a loss to understand what's going on. And that's, I think, what Job is working through here. What do we do in those cases where we're just at a complete loss of trying to understand? His friends are saying like they can understand any situation that happens, and so he's rejecting that.
Yeah. And he's going to turn to that in the next, after Zophar, he's going to attack the worldview. He's going to go right after it and go, this is what you think is happening, but you've forgotten this and this and this and this. And he's going to give all kinds of counterexamples to their worldview. It's like an attempt to make them be quiet, right? Let me just show you this doesn't work, so you have nothing to talk about. Um, but yeah, he's struggling with a lot of things, and in these two chapters, he's trying to find a way out, and he ultimately rejects every idea, and the end of the chapter is despair, right? He is in the dark, hasn't made any progress. Well, he makes progress, but you don't see it until later. Because some of the ideas he brings up and rejects here, he brings them up again later. And like the mediator, he rejects it here, comes up later, and he doesn't reject it then. So it's part of the book of Job is about the struggle, right? The slow, one step forward, two steps back type of progress to getting an understanding and restoring or getting back to that restored relationship with the Lord that Job goes through. And that it's basically, like I said in the introduction, the book of Job is about Job, who is a believer, being afflicted because he is a believer, and he's suffering for innocent. He's an innocent sufferer. He's not suffering because he did something. He's just suffering for it. That's just the way it is in the world, right? It's how God has arranged the world, and he is in the dark, and he's looking forward to the appearance of God, who will make all things right when Job gets to stand before him. And so that's our position, right? That's our position. We are suffering for many things that we didn't do, and we suffer for things that we do too. But we suffer for things that we didn't do, and we don't know why. We don't understand everything that's going on in the world, and we look forward to God appearing, vindicating His name, and making everything right. And that happens at the end. So it's about the struggle of faith right now. Becky.
So I think probably some of the things that he is saying is because his suffering is so intense that his need to understand has bypassed his faith. He hasn't lost his faith, and it isn't less than it was, but his suffering and need for understanding, because everything I see in here is trying to get a hold of the understanding. And the key piece that he's missing is that God and Satan had a summit, and he became the unknowing target of that.
Hmm.
And I mean, that's pretty huge piece to be missing. Uh, and um, and God is counting on and knows that Job's faith will ultimately win, and Satan is banking on that. There's no way that I could do everything to this guy and have him come out an even stronger believer. And but we have the advantage of knowing what happened and why. The revision, we have the history. He's living the story. And I think it's just absolutely incredible that he can go through that and hang on to his faith so staunchly.
Hmm.
He's questioning why. I think anybody would question, why? What did I do? You know,
Hmm.
and let me make it right. What can I do to make this right? Um, but all of these scriptures, everything that he is saying out loud goes back to he knows the answers to the questions that he's asking. And to me, that's belief and faith, that
Hmm.
he hasn't lost any of it. He's just so tortured right now that his questions are coming out loud. He can't keep them inside.
Hmm. Yeah, and he's asking him repeatedly and with more force because he, as time goes on, he's not getting any answer, right? And so he just says them more insistently. Plus, his friends are more annoying as time goes on. So,
those friends, we all have them, right?
so we've probably all been them.
Yes.
Well said.
Uh, well, I think we'll pick up with so we talked about the first option, which was court. He's going to drop it for half a verse and then he's going to return to it again. But it's ultimately a dead end. You can't bring God to court. And he is he desperately wants to have his relationship with God restored. He thinks that it'll be restored when he understands what's going on. Uh, but at the end of the book, he doesn't understand, and it's okay. He totally doesn't need to understand, right? And at the end of the book, God appears, and that's enough. And so for us, the application is um, we will all, God will appear, and we will all appear before him. And that thought, that reality is enough, right? For everything. God says, live this way, do this, follow me in faith, trust me, live by my spirit, read the word and humble yourself before me, serve your brothers and sisters, witness to the lost, pray for your enemies. No matter what happens, glorify me. And and then we get ourselves sometimes into troubles and difficulties and we start to stray and doubt. And it's because we have lost sight that he will appear and we will appear before him, and that will be enough. And if it's going to be enough, then it's enough right now. And that's the point of Job. He doesn't die and go to heaven. It's enough for Job now. And when God does appear and speak to Job, it's enough for Job then and for the rest of his life. So that's the point, that we know that God is in charge and God is good. God will fulfill his promises no matter what we experience, no matter what we see, and no matter what our friends say. We're trying to be helpful. So, all right. Well, it's 8 after. I'm going to turn off the recording